The Kinross case begins over Lake Superior, with cold air pressing against the glass and you sitting beside the file as the old radar trace waits quietly in front of us. There is no hurry here, and the lake is patient. On the evening of the 23rd of November 1953, the air around Kinross Air Force Base carried that late autumn hardness you can almost feel in your hands, the kind of cold that settles into metal, runway lights, and the dark fabric of a flight jacket. You can picture the base in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, not as a place of drama, but as a working post at the edge of a wide inland sea, where men watched scopes, checked radios, and listened to the low ordinary sounds of duty. The Kinross case, as it would later be called, began in that plain rhythm of procedure, with an unidentified radar return, a scrambled interceptor, and two young officers doing the work they had been trained to do. You turn the first page slowly, and the paper has the dry sound of something handled many times. The names come forward without needing to be raised. First Lieutenant Felix Eugene Moncler Jr. was the pilot. Second Lieutenant Robert L. Wilson was the radar observer in the rear seat. Their aircraft was a Northrop F-89C Scorpion, a heavy two-seat interceptor built for long watches in northern air, with a blunt nose, broad wings, and the serious look of a machine designed for the early Cold War sky. We don't need to make that sky larger than it was. It was already large enough. Lake Superior below it was dark, cold, and immense, stretching outward past the last clear line of shore. If you sit with the file for a moment, you can feel how ordinary the beginning is. There is a radar station near Sault Ste. Marie, watching the border country around the Sioux Locks, where the water routes between Lake Superior and the lower Great Lakes mattered deeply to commerce and defense. The operators were not storytellers. They were watchers of light and movement, trained to see blips and courses, to ask what belonged, what was expected, and what had wandered outside the known pattern. Their room would have had the softened green glow of screens, the faint warmth of equipment, the smell of tobacco in wool, and the small dry clicks of switches, touched by tired hands. On that night, something appeared where it needed explaining. The return was treated as an unknown, or at least as something requiring closer attention, and Kinross sent Moncler and Wilson into the air. We can imagine the runway behind them, the hard black strip under the landing lights, the Scorpion lifting away into darkness with its engines carrying a deep, steady sound across the field. You aren't watching a chase, not really. You're watching a procedure unfold. A signal had been noticed. A crew had been assigned. A controller had a voice in the headset. A pilot and observer followed the instructions that belonged to their work. As you read, the first important detail is not mystery, but distance. The aircraft moved out over Lake Superior, and the lake at night gives very little back. In daylight, Superior can shine like hammered steel or lie blue and flat beneath a pale sky. But at night in November, it becomes almost a silence. The water is deep, the shorelines are remote, and the weather can change in ways that make even simple searches slow and uncertain. For the men at the scopes, the F-89 was not a shape they could see with their eyes. It was a return on glass, a moving mark, a small sign of life and machinery traveling through cold air. Wilson had trouble making contact with the target on the aircraft's own radar. That small sentence matters, and we'll hold it gently. In the cockpit of an interceptor, the work was divided, with the pilot flying and the radar observer helping find and track what the ground station had first seen. If the airborne radar was difficult, then the ground controllers became even more important. You can hear the clipped but controlled voices, not dramatic, just practical, giving headings, distances, and corrections as the jet moved farther over the lake. You can imagine the earphones pressing against skin, the instrument lights glowing low, the smell of warmed plastic and metal inside the cockpit. The case file does not give us a clear window into those last minutes. It gives us points. It gives us motion. It gives us a radar picture remembered by the men who watched it. The two returns, the interceptor and the unknown, were seen moving closer together on the ground radar scope. That is one of the reasons the Kinross case stayed in public memory. On the glass, the two marks appeared to merge, and the expected separation did not come in the way controllers hoped to see it. We should be careful with that word, merge. It belongs to the radar screen, to a display, to dots and interpretation, not necessarily to what any human eye saw in the sky. Still, you pause there, because everyone did. When two radar returns come together, a controller waits for them to separate again. One aircraft may pass above another, one may pass below. The geometry of distance, altitude, and equipment can briefly make two things look like one. In a quiet room, with the glow of a scope on a man's face, seconds can become very deliberate. You can almost feel the stillness around the console, the way a pencil might stop moving over a log sheet. The blip did not behave in the clean way the watchers expected. Then the radio calls began, and Montler did not answer. We move carefully now, because this is where old cases can become crowded with guesses. There was no radio explanation from the cockpit, no calm report of trouble, no message that clearly told the ground what had happened. The Scorpion and its crew were simply gone from communication, and somewhere beneath that absence lay Lake Superior, wide and black under the November sky. Search efforts followed, as they had to, with aircraft and crews facing the practical limits of weather, darkness and water. You can picture men scanning the surface from windows, their breath perhaps fogging a little at the edges, the horizon low and grey when daylight returned. The search found no clear trace. That, more than any rumour, is the fact that gave the Kinross case its long coldness. A missing aircraft over land leaves roots, witnesses, broken trees, burned ground, or some mark that can be walked toward. A missing aircraft over deep northern water leaves a much different kind of file. The lake can take sound, metal, fuel, and certainty into itself, and then show only waves, weather, and distance. You look at the page and understand why investigators could work diligently and still end with empty hands. The absence was not proof of anything grand. It was the geography of the case. But the next page brings in another quiet complication, and we should let it arrive at its own pace. The complication was another aircraft, or perhaps the idea of one, sitting in the file like a pale note folded into a darker page. In some accounts, the unknown return was later described as a Canadian transport, a C-47, moving through the same broad airspace, and if you have spent time with old case files, you know how a single description can feel steady at first, then begin to soften at the edges. We should not push it faster than the documents allow. We simply sit with it, as the investigators did, and notice how much depended on radar, timing, and reports passed from one office to another. The Kinross case went cold partly because this question never settled into one clean shape. If the target was a Canadian aircraft, then Moncler and Wilson may have been closing on something ordinary, a known machine with men inside it, moving through the night without any intention of becoming part of a mystery. Yet the quiet problem remains. No other aircraft was reported missing. No crew came forward with the kind of report that would explain a collision, a close encounter, or a sudden event in the sky. You can feel the file resisting easy closure under your hand. The paper trail has that soft, worn feeling of officers speaking across borders. One agency asks, another replies. A name or aircraft type appears in one account, and then a later statement seems to narrow, deny, or adjust it. We are not listening for scandal here. We are listening for the ordinary difficulty of reconstructing a night from instruments, memories, and records made under pressure. You can imagine a clerk pulling a folder from a cabinet, the metal drawer sliding open with a low scrape, the typed page inside carrying the faint smell of ink and dry paper. In the early 1950s, radar was powerful, but it was not magic. It could show a return, suggest a course, and help a controller guide an interceptor. Yet it could also leave room for ambiguity. Altitude mattered, distance mattered, weather mattered, the curve of the Earth, the quality of the equipment, and the training of the operator all belonged to the picture. When we look back from our own time, it is easy to ask why the answer was not preserved cleanly. But you and I are sitting in the room as it was, with green light, tired eyes, and imperfect tools. There may have been ice in the air that night, or turbulence, or mechanical trouble that never had time to become words. There may have been some failure inside the Scorpion, a failure quick enough that neither Monclar nor Wilson could explain it over the radio. The aircraft itself was not a small machine, and a twin-engine interceptor carried many systems, many pressures, many ways for a normal flight to become difficult. You can hear the engines in your imagination, steady until they were not, and then the wide quiet of the lake taking the sound away from every human listener. Still, the case did not go cold because people failed to care. That is important. The Kinross case went cold because care met water, weather, and uncertainty. And those three things are patient in a way people can hardly match. The searchers could fly patterns and scan the surface. They could watch for debris, oil, wreckage, or a flash of color against gray waves. They could question airfields and offices. But Lake Superior in late November is not a small room where every corner can be checked. It is an inland sea with deep basins, hard weather, and long distances between answers. You turn the page again, and the names return, as they should. Felix Monclar was not only a pilot in a case file. He was a son, a husband, a father, and a man whose life had moved through Louisiana, military service, and the everyday duties of an officer. Robert Wilson was not only the second seat in an aircraft. He was young, trained, trusted, and present in that cockpit because the work required two sets of skill. When we speak of missing aircraft, the machinery can take over the story, but we should keep the two men clearly in view. Their families would have received news no family wants to receive, and then, after that, they would have entered the long corridor of not knowing. That corridor has its own sound. It is the phone that does not ring. It is the letter that arrives without the answer inside it. It is a kitchen table where someone reads the same sentence more than once, because the official language is careful, and careful language can feel cold even when the people writing it are trying to be kind. You can sit with that for a moment, without adding anything sharp to it. The official work continued as official work does, through searches, reports, reviews, and conclusions written in the plain style of military records. The aircraft was lost. The crew was missing. The exact cause was not known. Those words can look small on the page, but they carry a heavy weight. We know that weight by the quiet around them. You can imagine the stamp, the signature, the final line of a report placed into a folder, not because anyone believed the story was complete, but because a file sometimes closes in paperwork before it closes in the human heart. Years later, something shifted in the file, though not in a way that brought the old certainty everyone wanted. The Kinross case moved out of immediate military concern and into the slower world of memory, researchers, aviation historians, and people who study unexplained records from the Cold War period. That movement changes the texture of a case. The first investigators are trying to solve a live problem. Later researchers are trying to preserve what can still be known. You can feel the difference as you sit under the lamplight. The first stack of papers smells of duty and urgency. The later stack smells of archives, photocopies, and patient correspondence sent by people who could not let the question rest. In those later years, the radar story became the part people returned to most often. Two returns moved together. One return remained, or seemed to remain, for a short time. Then the Scorpion was gone. Depending on which account you read, the unknown object continued on, disappeared, or was later interpreted through another aircraft's presence. The details vary, and variation is where cold cases grow difficult. We can let the uncertainty be what it is. We do not need to force it into a shape tonight. We only need to notice how the lack of wreckage made every theory harder to test. This is where the human mind wants a firm object to hold. A recovered panel, a serial number, a witness on a shoreline who heard a sound, a fisherman who saw a flare, a maintenance note that clearly warned of failure before the flight. Cold cases often turn on such things, small enough to fit in an envelope, yet strong enough to change how the whole file reads. But in the Kinross case, the lake kept most of its evidence, and without the aircraft, every explanation remained partly suspended above the water. You can imagine an investigator years later standing over a map of Lake Superior. The paper is large and cool under the hand, with the shoreline bending around the upper peninsula, Ontario, islands, channels, and deep water marked in blue. A pencil might circle the approximate area. A ruler might trace the heading from Kinross. Notes might gather in the margins, each one careful, each one asking where the aircraft could have come down if the radar track was remembered correctly. Even this quiet act, drawing lines on a map, has humility in it, because the lake is much larger than the pencil. The weather, too, becomes a kind of witness, though an imperfect one. In November, over Superior, cold air can move heavily across the water, lifting moisture, making clouds, forming layers that trouble visibility and flight. The cockpit windows might have held the faint reflected glow of instruments, while outside there was only blackness, cloud, and the suggestion of a horizon that could not be trusted. We do not need to invent a storm if the record does not give us one. The season alone is enough. It tells us the search would be hard, the water dangerous, and the margin for recovery thin. The patient detective learns to respect margins. You learn it as you read these old files. A few miles in a radar estimate can matter. A few minutes in a flight timeline can matter. A misunderstanding between ground control and cockpit can matter, even if everyone involved is skilled and sincere. In the Kinross case, the available facts sit close together, but not close enough to lock. There is the scramble. There is the intercept course. There is the merging return. There is the loss of contact. There is the search. Then there is the quiet, empty place where the answer should be. That empty place drew many explanations over the decades. Some stayed within ordinary aviation. Some moved toward more unusual possibilities because the early Cold War sky was full of fear, secrecy, and speculation. But tonight, we stay with the patient work, the kind that keeps its hands on the documents and its voice low. You can look at the more unusual theories without being pulled into them. You can acknowledge that the unknown return was called unknown for a reason, and still remember that unknown is not the same as impossible, or strange, or proven beyond the evidence. Cold War language had a particular feel. It could make the ordinary sound official, and the uncertain sound both precise and incomplete. Air defense, intercept, target, scramble track. These words sit on the page with hard edges, yet behind them are human rooms, human voices, and human fatigue. You can hear a coffee cup placed on a desk. You can smell damp wool drying near a heater. You can see a man rubbing at his eyes while the scope glows in front of him. The Kinross case belongs to that world, where vast national concerns passed through small rooms, staffed by people doing one shift at a time. When a case goes cold, it rarely freezes all at once. It cools by degrees. First, the search area gives nothing back. Then, the urgent calls become scheduled letters. Then, the active investigation becomes a report. Then, the report becomes a folder. Then, the folder moves from one cabinet to another, and eventually from a working office to an archive. You can almost feel the temperature drop as we follow that path. The paper is the same, but its purpose changes. It no longer guides search planes over water. It waits for someone, years later, to ask again. But there was one more layer waiting in the later history of the Kinross case, and it came not from the night sky, but from the deep lake below it. Long after the disappearance, Searchers and researchers became interested in whether modern equipment might find what earlier efforts could not. That is another reason old cold cases sometimes stir again. Technology changes while questions remain. Sonar improves. Navigation becomes more accurate. Records can be compared with new maps. A lakebed that once seemed unreachable becomes something that can be scanned line by line. You can picture a small research vessel on cold water, its deck wet with spray, cables coiled near equipment cases, and a screen inside showing pale shapes rising from the darkness below. Lake Superior is not easy to search, even with modern tools. Its depth can be severe. Its weather can close in quickly. Its bottom is uneven, marked by ridges, mud, rock, and the slow settling of everything the lake has carried down through time. Searching for an aircraft there is not like searching a clean floor. It is more like reading a vast, dimly printed book where many pages are folded, torn, or hidden under silt. You and I can follow the effort with respect, because the patient act of looking is itself part of the story. At various points, claims have surfaced about possible wreckage connected to the Kinross disappearance. Some reports drew attention, especially when images or coordinates seemed to promise that the long silence might finally give way to an object on the lakebed. But promise is not proof, and old cases ask us to hold that difference carefully. You can imagine the first excitement, the phone calls, the emails, the printed sonar images spread across a desk. Then comes the slower work. Does the shape match the aircraft? Is the location plausible? Can the object be visited again? Can anything be confirmed without wishful thinking? This is one of the gentle disciplines of patient detective work. You let hope enter the room, but you do not let it rearrange the evidence. You let a possible lead breathe. You check it against the map. You compare it with known aircraft dimensions. You ask what agencies have confirmed, what families have been told, and what independent observers can verify. In the Kinross case, the claimed discoveries did not settle the matter in the official way a recovered wreck would have done. The lake, once again, gave a suggestion rather than an answer. For families and researchers, that can be its own kind of ache. A possible find may feel like the first clear sound after decades of muffled silence. Then, if it cannot be confirmed, the silence returns, and it may feel heavier because hope had briefly lifted it. We should be careful with that. We should speak of it with tenderness. Every cold case has people outside the documents. People who have lived with the question through ordinary mornings and winter evenings, through anniversaries, moves, aging photographs, and the strange endurance of a name spoken in the present tense. You turn another page, and perhaps there is a black and white photograph of the aircraft type. The Scorpion has the shape of its era, thick and purposeful, with straight wings and a cockpit arranged for two men who depended on each other's instruments, voices, and calm. The image might be slightly grainy, the edges silvered from copying. You can see why the machine mattered in the story, but you can also see how it has become a vessel for everything the file cannot say. It is not just an aircraft now. It is the place where the last known moments of Moncla and Wilson remain enclosed. The F-89C had a record like many aircraft of its period, shaped by rapid development, operational demands, and the learning curve of jet-age defense. Early jet interceptors asked a lot from pilots, maintainers, and systems that were still maturing. None of that gives us a simple cause for the Kinross disappearance. It only gives us context. A machine can be capable and still vulnerable. A crew can be trained and still meet circumstances beyond recovery. A flight can begin as routine and end with no report, no wreckage, and no final sentence. As you sit with this part of the file, the idea of routine becomes important. Routine is not dull in a case like this. Routine is what lets us see the break. The scramble from Kinross was part of a known pattern of air defense readiness. The radar station noticed something. The interceptor launched. The controller guided the crew, if all had gone normally. there would have been a return to base. A log entry, maybe a brief explanation of the unknown, and then another night of watchfulness. The file might never have existed in this form. Instead, the routine opened into absence. Not a dramatic absence, not the kind with music under it, but the quiet official absence of an aircraft overdue and unanswered. You can imagine the base after the first concern became certainty. More phones, more clipped voices, men stepping out into the cold air and looking toward the north, though there was nothing to see. The runway still there, the hangars still there, the lights still burning, and somewhere beyond all that ordinary light, the lake held whatever had happened. Across the years, the Kinross case has often been pulled toward the question of the unidentified radar return. Yet the coldness of the case also belongs to search conditions and evidence loss. We should keep both truths together. The radar story is unusual, and it naturally draws attention, but a missing jet over Lake Superior could become difficult to resolve even without any mystery object at all. Deep water changes investigation. Cold water slows recovery. Remote water disperses signs. Weather erases surface clues. Time turns metal into something harder to find and harder to recognize. You can feel how the case asks for two kinds of patience. One is technical patience, the patience of search grids, sonar lines, archival requests, and careful comparison. The other is emotional patience, the patience required to live beside an unanswered question without pretending it has been answered. Investigators need the first. Families are forced into the second. Researchers often carry both in small measure, because each new document can feel like a door, and each closed lead can feel like returning to the same quiet hallway. Years after the original search, the public memory of the Kinross case became tangled with the broader subject of unidentified flying objects. That was almost inevitable, because of the time period, the radar language, and the strange report of returns merging on the scope. The early 1950s were full of official concern about unknown aerial sightings. Newspapers, military officers, and civilian researchers were all trying to understand a sky that seemed newly crowded with possibilities. You can imagine clippings yellowing in a folder, their headlines more excited than the case itself deserves tonight. We keep our voice lower than those headlines. We look for what can be held. The interceptor was real, the crew was real, the radar track was reported. The search did not recover them. The explanation involving another aircraft remained complicated and, for many, unsatisfying. That is enough to make a cold case endure without adding brightness or alarm. It is enough that two men left a runway and did not come home, and that the lake gave no final answer to the people who waited. The human habit is to fill silence. It is understandable. Silence feels unfinished, and the mind wants to protect itself from unfinished things. So theories arrive: mechanical failure, collision, instrument error, misidentified transport, unusual atmospheric effect, a classified explanation, something stranger. Each theory places a small bridge over the unknown, and for a moment the gap feels easier to cross. But when you sit with the Kinross file carefully, you notice that most bridges do not reach the far side. They rest on a few facts, then fade in mist. This does not make the work useless. In patient detective work, ruling out what cannot be supported is part of honoring what remains. You can spend an evening with a theory and leave it where it is, not in anger, but because it cannot carry the weight placed on it. You can underline a date, compare a route, read a statement twice, and then close that avenue gently. There is dignity in that kind of restraint. It says the missing deserve truth more than they deserve a tidy story. When the next box comes down from the shelf, we find the wider world around Kinross waiting there, quiet and cold. Kinross Air Force Base sat within a defensive geography that shaped the entire event. The Upper Peninsula, the Canadian border, the locks at Sault Ste. Marie, and the broad approach over Lake Superior all mattered in Cold War planning. This was not a random patch of sky. It was watched because it connected industry, shipping, and national defense. Iron ore, grain, manufactured goods, and military concern all moved through this region in different ways. You can see why radar eyes were placed there, and why an unknown return would be treated seriously. The Sioux locks themselves are a calm subject when seen in daylight, with water rising and falling, ships easing through with patient power, and workers moving along concrete edges in coats and caps. But in a defense file, they become infrastructure, something to guard, something to watch over. The same place can have more than one meaning. To a sailor, it is a passage. To an engineer, it is a system. To a military planner in the 1950s, it is a vulnerable point. You and I hold those meanings together as we return to the radar room. The men at the scopes were not looking for mysteries. They were looking for tracks. A track is a modest thing, a sequence of positions joined by attention. It has no face, no intention, no story until people supply one. The radar return that drew Moncler and Wilson into the air began as such a track. It moved where it moved. It required identification. The controller's work was to guide the interceptor close enough for the crew to determine what it was. This is the slow, practical heart of the Kinross case, and it is easy to lose beneath later speculation. You can imagine the controller's hand near the microphone, the room warm from electronics, while the world outside the building was cold enough to sting. The voice would have carried instructions, corrections, perhaps reassurance in the simple steadiness of procedure. Heading changes, distance estimates, closing speed. A pilot listens differently at night over water. Instruments become the room. The headset becomes the thread back to Earth. The radar observer in the rear seat works within his own small pool of light, searching for the target that ground radar says should be there. If Wilson could not lock onto the target clearly, the uncertainty inside the cockpit would have had a texture all its own. Not panic work. Adjusting, checking, reporting, listening. The faint smell of heated wiring, the pressure of straps, the vibration through the seat, the cold pressing just beyond the canopy. Moncler flying the intercept. Wilson trying to find the return. Both men enclosed in a machine, moving through darkness over a lake that offered no visual references below. You can sit beside that image without forcing it to become more than we know. The official record, as it survives in public memory, leaves the final cockpit moments blank. This is one reason we speak gently. To describe what no one heard would be to step outside the file. We do not need to do that. The silence is enough. A radio call not answered has its own shape. A radar return lost has its own weight. A search pattern flown without result has its own slow exhaustion. You can feel the investigators learning, hour by hour, that the night would not give the crew back easily. There is a particular quiet around missing aircraft cases. It differs from cases with scenes that can be photographed and measured by daylight. Here the scene is enormous. It is air and water. It is last known position and probable path. It is a grid drawn over waves that move while you draw it. Evidence does not sit still. Floating debris drifts. Oil spreads. Small objects vanish among whitecaps. The lake surface changes every minute, and the lake bed waits far below, indifferent to the urgency above it. In that sense, the Kinross case went cold almost from the moment the search began, not because effort was absent, but because the environment was already erasing the narrow signs investigators needed. The searchers were working against darkness first, then against scale, then against time. You can imagine aircraft crews scanning until their eyes ached, trying to separate wave shine from wreckage, cloud shadow from smoke, nothing from something. It is tiring work, and it asks a person to keep hoping for a visible sign, while seeing only water. As days passed, the effort would have changed in mood. The first hours carry the language of rescue. Later hours begin to carry the language of recovery. Eventually, The language becomes administrative, though the feeling underneath may remain raw. Reports are filed. Weather is noted. Flight paths are reviewed. Families are informed, and then informed again, sometimes with very little new to say. You can hear how carefully people choose words when the truth is incomplete. They do not want to offer false hope, and they do not want to close the door too sharply. The absence of wreckage also meant the aircraft itself could not tell its part of the story. In many aviation investigations, the wreckage is a difficult but essential witness. Metal bends in patterns. Instruments freeze at settings. Engines carry marks of power or failure. A broken part may explain a chain of events that no one survived to describe. But the Scorpion from Kinross did not come back to a hangar floor for examination. It did not lie in a field under canvas. It did not offer its damage to investigators' hands. So the investigation had to lean on the things that remained. Radar observations, radio records, weather information, maintenance history, search reports, statements about other aircraft in the area. Each piece had value, but none could stand in for the missing machine. You can feel the imbalance in the file. There is enough to begin many questions, but not enough to finish them. That imbalance is one of the quiet engines of a cold case. It keeps the reader returning, not because the story is loud, but because the missing piece is so clearly shaped. But even an unfinished file has patterns, and we can follow them softly. The first pattern is the ordinary military procedure that brought the Scorpion into the air. The second is the radar convergence that made the case memorable. The third is the failure of search efforts to find physical proof. The fourth is the later disagreement about what the unknown return may have been. None of these patterns solves the Kinross case alone. Together, they explain why it became so difficult to close. You can trace them with your finger down the margin, 4 quiet lines running side by side into the same dark water. For investigators at the time, the most useful explanation may have been the one that fit familiar categories. An intercept mission went wrong. The aircraft was lost. The unknown was likely another aircraft or a radar interpretation that did not require extraordinary cause. That kind of conclusion is not careless by itself. It is often how investigations proceed. They begin with known possibilities: mechanical failure, pilot disorientation, weather, instrument issues, collision, or navigational confusion. A patient detective does not reject ordinary explanations simply because they are ordinary. Often, ordinary explanations are the ones that prove true, yet ordinary explanations still need evidence. That is the difficulty. If the Scorpion suffered mechanical failure, what failed? If there was a collision, where is the other damaged aircraft or witness report? If spatial disorientation played a role, what conditions support it? If the radar picture misled the controllers, how exactly did the track produce that appearance? Each question is sensible, and each one asks for material the case does not fully provide. You can see why the file stayed open in the minds of researchers, even when official attention moved on. The phrase "went cold" can sound passive, as though a case simply fell asleep. But the Kinross case did not fall asleep in that way. It was covered by deep water, limited evidence, and the forward motion of institutions that cannot keep every file active forever. People were transferred, radar rooms changed, aircraft types retired, bases were renamed, repurposed, or closed. The Cold War itself moved through its long decades. Meanwhile, the question remained almost exactly where it had been on that November night, hovering above Lake Superior, waiting for proof. You can feel time in the materials. Early pages may speak in the language of immediate operations. Later pages may carry the marks of requests under public record rules, letters from researchers, articles clipped and folded, maps printed from newer sources, and notes written by people who were not alive when the aircraft disappeared. Time changes the handwriting around a mystery. The first generation writes to find the missing, the second writes to understand what the first knew, the third writes because the silence has become part of regional memory, and regional memory matters here. Around the Great Lakes, people understand water differently than those who see lakes only as pretty surfaces. They know weather can rise fast. They know depth can hide large things. They know ships have vanished, aircraft have gone down, and stories can attach themselves to stretches of water where the shore looks calm from a distance. Lake Superior especially carries a reputation for cold preservation and sudden severity. You do not need to exaggerate it. Anyone who has stood near its shore in November can feel enough in the wind. The shore itself becomes part of the atmosphere of the case. Imagine standing somewhere along that northern water after sunset, your coat collar turned up, the stones underfoot damp and hard, the air smelling of mineral cold and wet leaves. The lake does not look like a place that explains itself. It looks like a dark surface moving in low folds. Somewhere beyond sight, the flight path crossed the water. Somewhere beyond reach, perhaps, metal settled. You stand there with the file in mind, and the distance between knowing and not knowing feels physical. In the archive, the same distance appears as paper. A typed line says the aircraft disappeared from radar. Another line says search efforts found nothing. Another account discusses the possible Canadian transport. You can read each line clearly, but the space between them remains wide. That is where many listeners, many researchers, and many family members have lingered, not in wild excitement, in the simple human wish to place one fact beside another and have them meet cleanly. The Kinross case denies that clean meeting, and so it endures. Across town or across the border, another file may once have held the routine flight records of aircraft moving through the region that night. That is one of the soft frustrations of old investigations. Records that seem ordinary when created may become vital years later, but ordinary records are not always kept forever. A flight plan, a radio log, a maintenance note, a weather observation, a duty roster, each may be handled according to rules that make sense at the time. Decades later, a researcher may discover that the very paper needed most has thinned, vanished, or sits uncatalogued in a place no one has checked. You can almost hear the archive cart rolling down a hallway, wheels ticking over a seam in the floor, fluorescent lights humming faintly above. A box arrives, and the lid comes off with a dry sigh of cardboard. Inside may be nothing decisive. That is often how patient investigation feels. You make the request, wait for the response, open the folder, and find context instead of conclusion. But context is not nothing. It tells us what people knew, what they believed, what they wrote down, and what they did not know enough to preserve. In the Kinross case, context tells us about an air defense system still learning itself. It tells us about radar operators interpreting returns in real time, about pilots flying machines built for a tense era, and about a vast border region where ordinary flights and military concerns shared the same sky. It tells us that the language of unidentified targets did not always mean something exotic. Sometimes it meant only that a return had not yet been identified. But it also tells us that identification, once missed, may not be easy to recover later. The unknown return remains a quiet center of gravity. You can look away from it for a while, toward the lake, the aircraft, the search, the families, and the base. Then you return, because the file returns. What was it? A transport? A radar anomaly? A known aircraft whose paperwork did not align neatly with the intercept? Something the operators could not name because the night was moving faster than the record. We ask these questions softly. We do not crowd them. The answers, if they exist, have had a long time to hide. When researchers consider a possible Canadian aircraft, they must deal with both geography and bureaucracy. Where was it said to be flying? What route would bring it near the target? Did it report any incident? Did Canadian authorities confirm or deny the identification? Were American accounts relying on early information that later became less certain? Each question has the feel of a drawer opened in another office. You can smell dust and carbon paper. You can feel the thinness of copies. You can see why a clean answer, once missed in the early days, might become harder with every passing decade. There is also the matter of how radar tracks were recorded and remembered. Today, people may imagine permanent recordings, digital trails, stored data, and precise replay. In 1953, the work depended much more on operators, logs, and the immediate interpretation of what appeared on the scope. A return could be watched, plotted, and described, but the exact visual moment might survive only in human recollection and written summary. That does not make it worthless. It makes it human. And human records, as you know from this old desk tonight, have edges softened by time. The word merge may have begun as a simple description of two blips occupying the same space on a display. Later, it became the heart of many retellings. This is how cases change as they travel. A technical observation becomes an image. The image becomes a question. The question becomes almost a scene, even though no one saw two physical objects meet in the sky. Patient work asks us to walk the image back to its source. We keep the word, but we loosen our grip on what it might mean. That kind of loosening can feel unsatisfying, but it is honest. You and I do not need to know less in order to sleep. We need to hold what is known with care and let the unknown remain unforced. The Kinross case asks for exactly that. It asks us to sit beside a lake we cannot drain, a radar screen we cannot replay perfectly, and a cockpit we cannot hear. The quiet detective in us keeps turning pages anyway, not because certainty is guaranteed, but because patience is a form of respect. The next part of the file feels colder, because it belongs to the water after the voices stopped. Search and recovery over Lake Superior would have required decisions made under imperfect information. Where was the last radar position? What was the aircraft's heading? How fast was it moving? If it descended, how far could it have traveled before impact? If it broke apart, how wide might the debris field be? If it entered the water intact, how much might appear on the surface? These are practical questions, the kind that can be asked in a briefing room while maps lie flat under gloved or ink-stained hands. Each answer would have carried uncertainty. A small error at altitude can become a large area on the lake. Wind can move floating material. Currents can complicate drift. Weather can delay or limit flights. Even daylight does not make cold water generous. You can imagine the search aircraft moving in slow patterns. Engines droning. Observers leaning toward windows. Every pale fleck on the surface briefly becoming possible. Their work was not glamorous. It was repetitive, tiring, and necessary. That is often the real shape of care in an investigation. When nothing is found, the search does not simply stop in the heart. It may stop in the official schedule, because resources have limits and probabilities decline. But the inner search continues for those attached to the missing. A wife may keep listening for news. A parent may keep a photograph nearby. A colleague may remember a voice in the ready room. A researcher, decades later, may pause over the same last known coordinates and feel the old question become present again. In that sense, the Kinross case never belonged only to the people on duty that night. You can see why cold case work often becomes an act of tending. The file is not alive, but the memory inside it is. Someone keeps the names spelled correctly. Someone corrects a date. Someone refuses to let a rumor replace a person. Someone notes that Moncler and Wilson were more than symbols in a mystery. This quiet tending matters. It is not the same as solving the case, but it preserves the human center while the evidence remains incomplete. There is a temptation, in cases involving aircraft and unknown radar returns, to let the machine language dominate everything. Speeds, headings, altitudes, signatures, models, and designations can fill the page until the two men fade. We should use those details because they help us understand the work, but we should not let them take all the air. Felix Moncler had a life before that runway. Robert Wilson had a life before that rear seat. Their families lived after the file was created. The cold case is not only about what vanished from radar. It is about who did not come home. The Scorpion itself, though, deserves its place in the patient account. It was built for interception, not comfort. A crew inside it at night would have lived inside sound, vibration, instrument glow, and procedure. The pilot's hands would know the controls through gloves and training. The observer's attention would move between instruments, scope, and voice communication. The outside world would be mostly absent, reduced to readings and instructions. Over land, there might be scattered lights below. Over Lake Superior, especially in that season, there may have been almost nothing. That darkness can matter to a pilot. Without clear visual reference, a person must trust instruments, training, and the voice guiding them. Jet aircraft of that period could move quickly through conditions where the senses alone were unreliable. A turn, a descent, a correction, a moment of distraction, any of these can take on importance, though we cannot say which, if any, belong to this flight. We only note the environment. We note the night. We note the water. We note that the final explanation did not survive in a form investigators could hold. As you settle deeper into the file, the cold case becomes less a single question and more a series of closed doors. Behind one door is the mechanical history of the aircraft. Behind another is the radar interpretation. Behind another is the possible Canadian transport. Behind another is the lakebed. Behind another is the human memory of people who were working that night. Some doors open a little, some do not open at all. Patient detective work means accepting that not every door will give way in the same evening. And yet, even closed doors have details around their frames. The date, the 23rd of November. The place, near Kinross and out over Lake Superior. The aircraft, an F-89C Scorpion. The men, Felix Moncler and Robert Wilson. The mission, an intercept of an unknown radar return. The result, disappearance and no confirmed recovery. These details return like low notes in the narration. They keep us oriented. If you drift and come back, you can find them again, steady as the lamp on the desk. But there was one more quiet reason the Kinross case endured, and it has to do with the way official answers can feel incomplete even when they are reasonable. An official file is written for procedure, not for grief. It must state what can be stated, avoid what cannot, and move toward an administrative end. That kind of writing is necessary. It keeps records clear. It prevents speculation from being treated as fact. But to a family or to a later reader, official restraint can feel like distance. The report may say the aircraft is presumed lost, and the reader may want to know how the room sounded when that sentence was typed. The report may name the crew, and the reader may want to know who spoke those names at home. This difference between official language and human need is one of the oldest tensions in cold cases. The state must record, the family must live. The investigator must move from one task to another, while the unanswered question remains fixed in one household. You can feel this tension in the Kinross case, because the physical evidence never arrived to soften it. A recovered wreck might not remove grief, but it can give shape to it. It can tell people where to stand, what happened broadly, and what no longer needs to be imagined. Without that, imagination keeps working. It may work quietly for years. A child grows older and wonders. A spouse hears an aircraft overhead and remembers. A sibling sees a winter lake and thinks of cold water. None of this appears in the official record, or only rarely. Yet it is part of why we speak gently. We are not handling a puzzle made of pieces with no owners. We are handling a story that remained unfinished in real lives. The public, too, tends to treat unsolved cases as invitations. Some enter with care. Others enter with certainty too quickly. The Kinross case has seen both. There are careful aviation researchers who try to understand the aircraft, the radar, and the search. There are people drawn by the unexplained radar return, interested in the larger history of unknown aerial reports. There are skeptics who prefer mundane causes and ask for physical proof. There are believers who see the merging blips as something beyond ordinary explanation. The file sits among all of them, unchanged in its central silence. You tonight do not have to choose a camp. You can be the patient reader instead. You can let each interpretation rest on the table and ask what supports it. You can notice when a theory grows heavier than its evidence. You can notice when a dismissal becomes too easy, as though the lack of proof were itself a complete answer. The quiet detective position is more humble than either certainty. It says, here is what we know, here is what we don't, and here is where the lake begins. That humility is not weakness. It is the discipline that keeps old mysteries from becoming distorted. The Kinross case deserves that discipline because its facts are already compelling without ornament. A military interceptor launched from Michigan. 2 officers flew into the night. Radar watchers saw the track close with another return. Communication ended. The aircraft was not found. Decades passed. Claims, explanations, and searches came and went. The essential absence remained. You can tell the truth plainly, and the truth still has enough quiet gravity to hold the room. In the lamplight, the map of Lake Superior seems almost too large for the desk. It stretches beyond the edges, as though the paper itself cannot contain the water. To the southeast is the area near Sault Ste. Marie and Kinross. To the north is Canada. The lake reaches westward into distance and weather. You may trace the shoreline with your eyes and feel how many places there are for an answer to hide. The scale does not excuse the lack of resolution, but it helps us understand it. Scale is one of the least dramatic and most powerful facts in this case. Deep water does not need to be mysterious in order to conceal. It only needs to be deep. Weather does not need to be violent in order to hinder. It only needs to be cold, dim, and wide. Records do not need to be destroyed deliberately in order to vanish. They only need to be ordinary, old, and subject to normal retention. When you combine those plain conditions, a case can go cold without any single dramatic failure. That is perhaps the most contemplative part of the Kinross story. It reminds us that unanswered questions are often made from ordinary limits. Human sight has limits. Instruments have limits. Search resources have limits. Memory has limits. Paper has limits. Even care has limits when it meets a lake the size of a small sea. We can wish it were otherwise and still recognize the truth of it. The old file is not a locked room with one clever key. It is a shoreline in fog, where each step shows a little more ground, and then no more. The next page asks us to return to the night itself, not to solve it, but to listen to its sequence once more. The radar station sees a return. Kinross scrambles the interceptor. Moncler and Wilson climb into the dark. Ground control guides them toward the target. The aircraft's own radar has difficulty. The ground scope shows closure. The returns appear to come together. Radio contact is lost. Search efforts begin. No confirmed wreckage is recovered. You can repeat those steps quietly, like beads on a string, and still the final bead is missing. Repetition can be useful in a cold case. Not dramatic repetition, not a pounding rhythm, but the gentle act of walking the same path again, to see whether some overlooked stone catches the light. Investigators do this. Archivists do this. Families do this in their own way. They return to the last known facts, because the last known facts are the nearest edge of the unknown. In the Kinross case, that edge lies over water, under a November sky, with a radar screen glowing in a room miles away. If we imagine the radar operator, we should imagine him as a worker, not as a witness to legend. He is watching his equipment. He is doing a job that requires concentration and calm. The room may be dim. The air may be dry from heating. A telephone might sit nearby. A logbook may be open, its lines waiting for times and notations. When the blips draw together, he observes and reports, according to training. Only later does that moment become the image everyone remembers. At the time, it was part of unfolding work. That difference between lived moment and later meaning appears again and again in old cases. At the time, a detail is one of many. Later, because of what follows, it becomes central. A date on a log, a missed call, a witness who thought a sound was ordinary, a radar trace that seemed procedural until the aircraft did not return. The Kinross case teaches this gently. We rarely know, while living through a moment, which details will become the ones strangers study decades later. For Moncler and Wilson, the flight may have felt demanding but not exceptional at first. We should be careful, again, not to step into their thoughts, as though we can know them. Still, their training existed for such work. An intercept at night was serious, but it was not outside the purpose of their aircraft. The ordinary confidence of professionals may have filled those first minutes. Checklists, instruments, instructions, responses, the runway falling away, the climb, the heading out over the lake, the steady attempt to turn an unknown return into an identified one. There is something deeply human in that assignment, to go toward the unknown, not because of curiosity, but because it is your duty to identify it, to reduce uncertainty for others, to turn a mark on a screen into a report someone can use. That is detective work in its broadest sense. It is not always magnifying glasses and interviews. Sometimes it is radar, fuel, cold air, and a voice in the headset. Sometimes it is two men in a jet and a controller guiding them toward a question. The tragedy, spoken softly, is that the question outlived them. It remained after the engines were silent. It remained after the search ended. It remained after the file was stored. It remains in every retelling that has to say unknown with care. The Kinross case went cold because the question could not be brought back down to earth. It stayed spread across radar, water, weather, and memory, too wide for any one explanation to gather completely. As the years moved on, the physical world of the case changed. The aircraft type became historical. The base's role changed. The men who worked the radar rooms aged, retired, and passed from living memory. The Cold War context became something students read about rather than a daily pressure in the room. Yet Lake Superior remained. That constancy gives the case a strange stillness. The institutions moved forward, but the water stayed where it was, keeping its own slow archive below the surface. Underwater searches bring their own form of quiet. A sonar screen does not reveal the bottom as a bright, clean photograph. It gives shapes, shadows, textures, and anomalies. A trained eye learns to read them. A rock can look like wreckage. Wreckage can disappear into clutter. A promising form can change when viewed from another angle. You can imagine researchers leaning over the display, the cabin rocking slightly, the smell of damp gear and diesel, the lake knocking softly against the hull. The work is careful, repetitive, and deeply uncertain. When a possible object appears, the heart may move faster than the evidence. That is natural. After decades, any shape can feel like a voice from below, but patient work asks for return passes, better imaging, independent review, and, if possible, direct inspection. The lake does not make any of this easy. Depth costs money, weather costs time, equipment fails, Coordinates must be precise. Even reaching the same spot again can require more effort than a reader might imagine. The old cold case does not yield simply because technology has improved. And if a claim cannot be verified, it becomes another layer in the story, rather than the answer. The Kinross case has collected such layers. They are not all equal, and they should not all be treated as proof, but they show the persistence of attention. People have kept looking. People have kept looking. People have tried to match sonar returns to aircraft dimensions and old coordinates. Even when those efforts fail to close the file, they show that the case still has a small circle of caretakers. That word, caretakers, feels right tonight. It is gentler than theorists, broader than investigators, and warmer than researchers. A caretaker of an old case does not own it. They tend it. They keep it from being overgrown by careless retelling. They trim back exaggeration. They preserve names. They leave room for uncertainty. In the Kinross case, caretaking means remembering that a radar mystery is also a family loss, that a missing aircraft is also a workplace tragedy, and that Lake Superior is not a stage, but a real place with real depth. You turn the page, and there may be a reproduction of an official statement, its language formal and controlled. The wording may attempt to explain the unknown return as a friendly or civilian aircraft, or to place the loss within known aviation risks. Perhaps the language feels too neat. Perhaps it feels like the best available answer at the time. We can allow both impressions. Official explanations can be sincere and incomplete. Public doubts can be understandable and still unproven. The space between those truths is where the Kinross case has rested for so long. This is why the case attracts patient minds. It does not give itself easily to one discipline. Aviation history helps, but not enough. Military records help, but not enough. Radar knowledge helps, but not enough. Underwater search helps, but not enough. Family history helps, but not enough. Each field brings a lamp, and the light reaches part of the room. No single lamp fills the whole space. So we move slowly, carrying one light at a time, noticing what each reveals and what remains in shadow. The sensory world of the case keeps returning, because the facts alone can feel too thin for the weight they carry. The cold runway. The green radar glow. The cloth of a uniform sleeve brushing a desk. The electric hum in an operations room. The dark water below the flight path. The stiff paper in an archive box. These details do not solve anything, but they help us stay near the human scale. A cold case is not only a sequence of data points, it is a set of lived environments where people made decisions with what they had. If you were the detective tonight, sitting with this file beside a small lamp, you might write one sentence in your notebook. The case depends on what the radar showed and what the lake kept. That sentence would not be enough, but it would be honest. The radar gave the shape of the event. The lake withheld the proof. Between those two facts, decades of uncertainty opened. You might underline withheld, then pause, because it sounds almost intentional, and the lake has no intention. It only has depth. Depth is difficult for the imagination. We can picture distance across a surface more easily than distance downward. Lake Superior's depths can swallow buildings, towers, and sound. An aircraft on the bottom might be preserved, broken, buried, scattered, or hidden among natural forms. The water above it would look ordinary to anyone passing by. A gull might cross the surface. A ship might move miles away. Snow might fall and melt. Nothing at the surface would announce that an answer, or part of one, could be resting far below. The searchers in 1953 did not have the tools later generations would bring. Their work belonged to the surface and the sky. They could look, listen, question and calculate, but they could not peel back the lake bed at will. That limitation matters. When we ask why the Kinross case went cold, we should not picture neglect as the first answer. We should picture a vast search area and limited means. We should picture men doing their best in the cold, then confronting a silence that their methods could not penetrate. There is a humility in old technology that modern readers sometimes forget. We live in an age of stored tracks, satellite images, digital maps, and instant messages, so we expect the world to leave a trail. In 1953, many trails were brief. A radar return glowed, moved, and was gone. A voice transmission existed in the moment it was heard. A log entry captured what someone had time and training to write. If the physical object disappeared, the record could become thin very quickly. The Kinross case is, in part, a lesson in that thinness. But thin does not mean empty. It means every remaining detail deserves care. The names deserve care. The date deserves care. The location deserves care. The distinction between radar appearance and physical event deserves care. The difference between an official explanation and confirmed evidence deserves care. You can feel how much of patient investigation is simply refusing to blur things for convenience. It is slow work. It can be unsatisfying. It is also the only way an old file remains honest. The next question, then, is not only what happened over Lake Superior, but why the available explanations failed to quiet the case. For some people, the answer involving a Canadian transport never fully matched the known aftermath. If another aircraft had been involved closely enough to produce the radar event, why did no confirmed collision evidence appear? If it was simply nearby, why did the Scorpion vanish at that moment? If the unknown continued safely, why was the intercept lost without a separate cause? These are fair questions. They do not prove anything extraordinary. They simply show why the explanation did not close the emotional or investigative loop for everyone who studied the case. For others, the radar merge itself may have been overinterpreted. Aircraft at different altitudes can align on a display. Radar resolution can make separate things appear as one. Operators may describe a complex track in simplified language later. A loss of contact after convergence can be coincidental if mechanical failure or spatial disorientation occurred at nearly the same time. These are also fair points. Patient detective work lets them stand. It asks us to compare probabilities without pretending probability is the same as proof. You can feel the file balancing there, neither tipping fully one way nor the other. That balance is tiring if you want a verdict, but calming if you let it be a record of limits. The Kinross case went cold because every path towards certainty narrowed before reaching the end. The aviation path lacked wreckage. The radar path lacked replayable data. The other aircraft path lacked a clean confirming report. The underwater path lacked verified recovery. The historical path lacked living witnesses who could answer every later question. So the case became a place where careful people could keep working in small ways. Someone might check aircraft loss records. Someone might examine maps of likely debris fields. Someone might request archived correspondence. Someone might interview descendants, not to disturb them, but to preserve what family memories still carried. Someone might compare retellings and remove errors that had accumulated over time. That is not glamorous work, but it is the patient detective work this story is really about. It happens quietly, often without applause, often without a final discovery. There is a kind of tenderness in correcting an old record, a middle initial, a rank, a date, an aircraft variant. These things may seem small beside the unanswered fate of a crew, but they matter because they are within reach. When the largest answer cannot be found, accuracy in the smaller answers becomes a way of refusing carelessness. You can imagine a researcher at a kitchen table late at night, papers spread beside a cup of cooling tea, checking one line against another until the room grows still. That image belongs to the Kinross case, as much as the radar room does. Cold cases live in later rooms too. They live in libraries, basements, local history offices, online archives, and quiet houses where someone has kept a clipping because throwing it away would feel wrong. The investigation becomes distributed across time. The first searchers had aircraft and radios. Later caretakers have scanners, letters, public records, and patience. Different tools, same human wish. To know what happened, to bring names back from abstraction, to give the unknown a smaller, truer shape. As you continue through the file, you may notice how the case resists speed. If you rush, it becomes only a strange radar story. If you slow down, it becomes a study in how uncertainty is made. A night flight, a border defense system, a young jet age, a cold inland sea, a missing aircraft, a possible second plane, a search without recovery, a later culture eager for mystery. Each piece adds a little weight, and none should be allowed to crush the others. The calm pace lets them remain distinct. That is why we return to Lake Superior again and again. It is not background. It is part of the mechanism by which the case went cold. A disappearance over a field leaves a different record. A disappearance over a city leaves witnesses. A disappearance over shallow water may allow divers, dragging, recovery, and examination. Over Superior, in November, a loss could pass almost immediately beyond the practical reach of the era. You can hear the wind across the surface as a kind of answer, not the answer we want, but one that explains the silence. The shoreline communities around the lake have long understood that silence. Ships have been overdue. Storms have rewritten schedules. Families have waited for men who worked on water. The Kinross case fits into that broader Great Lakes memory, though it came from the sky rather than from a deck. The lake does not distinguish much between the two. Metal enters, cold closes. Searchers look. Sometimes they find, sometimes they do not. The human story changes, but the water's role remains much the same. In our quiet room tonight, the lake is on the map, but also in the air of the narration. You can smell wet stone. You can feel cold glass under your fingertips. You can hear a distant radiator, almost like the hum of old equipment. The file lies open. The names are still legible. The question has not changed. Why did the Kinross case go cold over Lake Superior? Because the last known facts led outward into an environment that could hide them, and because every later explanation stopped short of proof. That sentence may be true, but it is not the end, and we will not treat it like an ending. Instead, we let it become a resting place before the next page. There is still more to sit with. The aircraft's mission, the uncertainty around identification, the later claims of discovery, the way cold cases gather meaning as they pass from official record into public memory. You turn the page softly, and the paper gives that small, dry sound again, as though even after all these years, the file still expects someone to listen. Listening, in a case like Kinross, means letting the official words and the unspoken spaces share the same desk. You may read a line about a presumed crash, then look up from the page and feel how much that line cannot hold. It cannot hold the cold of the cockpit, or the low light in the radar room, or the waiting that began when the Scorpion did not answer. It cannot hold the families receiving careful news in careful voices. It can only mark the fact, and then the fact sits there, smaller than the grief around it. The file asks us to think about identification, because identification was the reason the flight happened. An unknown radar return appeared, and the air defense system responded in the way it was designed to respond. We can imagine the system as a chain of attention, not a single dramatic decision. One person notices, another confirms, a call is made, a crew is assigned, a jet is prepared or already waiting. A controller begins to guide the interceptor toward the return. Each link seems ordinary by itself, but together they carried Moncler and Wilson out over Lake Superior. In that world, to identify something was to reduce risk. The unknown could be harmless, and often it was. A flight plan not matched quickly, a civilian or military aircraft where paperwork lagged behind the screen, a radar return shaped by weather or equipment. But the Cold War made uncertainty serious, especially near the Sulaks and the border airspace around Michigan and Ontario. You can feel that seriousness in the quiet precision of the work. Nobody needed to raise their voice. The procedures themselves carried the weight. The Kinross case went cold because the identification never completed. That is one of the gentlest and clearest ways to say it. The mission set out to turn an unknown into a known, and instead it created another unknown, deeper and more lasting than the first. The original radar return may have been an aircraft, an error, or something not properly matched to available records. The interceptor, once completely known to the system, became the missing object. You can sit with that reversal for a moment, because it is the hinge on which the whole case turns. In the room with the radar scope, known and unknown were not philosophical ideas. They were marks on glass, voices on radios, and entries in a log. A known aircraft had a track, a purpose, a call sign, a crew, and a base to return to. An unknown return needed attention until it could be named. When the Scorpion vanished, the category changed with terrible quietness. The men sent to identify became the ones others tried to locate. The watchers became searchers. The system folded back on itself. If you were reviewing the Kinross file as a detective tonight, you might begin by writing down the first simple question. What did the controllers believe they were seeing? Not what later writers thought, not what rumor enlarged, but what the operators understood in those minutes. Their interpretation shaped the intercept. Their observations shaped the later record, yet their experience was tied to equipment and training from a specific moment in history. We have to meet them there, under the green glow, rather than asking them to have seen with our tools. Radar in that era could be both remarkable and limited. It extended human sight across darkness, cloud and distance, but it did not turn the sky into a clear picture. Returns could fade, strengthen, split, overlap, or behave in ways that required interpretation. Ground clutter, altitude differences, and atmospheric conditions could complicate what appeared on the screen. The operator had to read motion through instruments and time. The controller had to translate that reading into guidance for a pilot. The pilot had to trust the voice while flying through air no one in the room could feel. That layered distance matters. The controller was not beside the Scorpion. The radar operator was not seeing the aircraft with eyes. Moncler and Wilson were not looking down at the scope in the radar room. Each person had part of the picture, and the complete picture did not exist in any one place. In patient detective work, we learn to respect that kind of fragmentation. It explains how sincere people can produce a record that still leaves later readers uncertain. The sensory detail of that fragmentation is simple. A headset pressing over ears, a pencil moving across paper, a hand adjusting a dial, a gloved hand on a control yoke, a radar screen glowing against a face, a lake lying dark beneath cloud. The pieces were connected by radio and procedure, but they remained physically separate, and when communication broke, the separation became final. You can feel how quickly the system would have searched for the missing thread. Call the aircraft, check the frequency, ask for response, watch the screen, call again. No answer changes a room. At first it is a technical problem. Then it becomes a concern. Then, after enough seconds and minutes, it becomes something heavier. We should not imagine panic. Military rooms are trained against panic. Instead, we might imagine attention tightening, voices becoming slightly more clipped, men turning toward one another, and the ordinary background sounds becoming clearer. The hum of equipment, the paper under a hand, the faint sound of weather against the building. The silence from the aircraft would not be empty. It would be full of work. The work, at that point, becomes search and explanation. Where did the aircraft last appear? What was its altitude? What direction was it flying? Did anyone hear a distress call? Did any other station track the unknown? Could the return have been friendly? Could weather account for the loss? Each question opens a narrow drawer. Some drawers hold a useful page. Some hold nothing. Some hold a page that seems useful until you compare it with another. That is how the Kinross case begins to take its cold shape. We keep returning to the possible Canadian aircraft because it sits like a folded note inside several later tellings. The explanation is attractive because it keeps the event within the normal world of aviation. If Munkler and Wilson were intercepting a C-47 or another transport, then the unknown becomes known in a general sense. Yet the difficulty remains in the fit. The disappearance of the Scorpion still needs its own cause, and the other aircraft, if present, did not supply the kind of obvious event that would have closed the matter. You can imagine investigators asking across official channels, was there a Canadian aircraft in the area? Did it report anything unusual? Did it land safely? Did it have damage? Were its times and route consistent with the radar return? Such questions are not glamorous, but they are essential. They move through offices, over telephones, in letters, in typed replies, and through the routines of two neighboring countries whose military systems overlapped but did not become one system. The smell of carbon paper and warm typewriter ribbon belongs to this part of the story. If a Canadian transport was truly the unknown, then the Kinross case becomes, in one sense, less strange, and, in another sense, no less unresolved. A routine intercept of a routine aircraft could still end in tragedy. Through mechanical failure, weather, disorientation, or some other aviation hazard. But the timing of the radar convergence would continue to trouble readers, because human beings notice patterns. When one mark meets another, and then one disappears, the mind links them. Patient investigation asks whether the link is causal, visual, coincidental, or misunderstood. That is a small question with a very large shadow. A radar display can make separate altitudes look close if the display does not give the viewer a three-dimensional picture in the way the imagination later supplies. Two aircraft can pass at different heights and still appear to meet on a screen. A return can be lost for reasons unrelated to physical contact. An aircraft can descend beyond radar coverage or be masked by conditions. These explanations are not dramatic, but they are part of the honest landscape. We place them beside the unanswered questions, and the file grows more complex rather than simpler. For a sleepy listener, complexity can be gentle when it is not rushed. You do not have to solve each branch tonight. You can let each possibility lie where it belongs. Mechanical trouble goes on one side. Radar interpretation goes on another. Collision goes farther down the table, requiring evidence that never appeared. Misidentification rests near the Canadian transport question. Unusual atmospheric or electronic effects sit near the radar discussion. Speculative explanations remain at the edge, visible but not allowed to crowd the names of the men. The lamp holds them all in soft light. When the Kinross case passed into the hands of later researchers, it also passed into a different culture of record reading. People were no longer working from fresh calls and living operational memory. They were reading copies, summaries, newspaper articles, declassified material, and accounts already shaped by previous retellings. That adds another layer of uncertainty. A detail repeated often can begin to feel stronger than it is. A phrase can travel from one article to another until no one remembers its first source. The patient reader must keep asking, where did this line begin? You might mark those questions in the margin. First source, later interpretation, official statement, family account, newspaper retelling, researcher's reconstruction. Each category has value, but they are not the same value. A radar operator's immediate log is different from a magazine article written years later. A military report is different from a public relations explanation. A family memory is different from an aircraft maintenance record. The Kinross case requires us to sort those textures with care, the way an archivist sorts paper by weight, age, and origin. The texture of paper can tell its own quiet story. Original onion skin copies feel thin and almost brittle. Photocopies carry grey shadows at the edges, newspaper clippings yellow and curl. Modern printouts are bright, but sometimes detached from their original context. When you hold an old file, you learn that information is not weightless. It comes through materials, and materials age. The Kinross case has been carried through many such materials, from operational records to articles to scanned pages, and each passage can preserve, distort, or emphasize something different. This is one reason no careful retelling should sound too certain. Certainty may be comforting, but it can become a false kindness. The better kindness is accuracy, spoken softly. Moncler and Wilson disappeared during an intercept mission over Lake Superior. The aircraft was not recovered in a confirmed way. The radar account remains central and debated. Explanations exist, but none has given the case the full closure that recovered evidence might have provided. These statements are modest. They do not answer everything, but they let the truth sit upright. The lake itself remains the largest unexamined document. That phrase may feel strange, but it fits. Somewhere in the water, or in the absence of what the water has not yielded, lies the physical part of the record. The lake bed may hold metal, or it may have scattered and buried it beyond recognition. It may hold nothing in the area people have searched, because the last known position was imprecise. It may hold the aircraft far from the lines drawn on later maps. A cold case over water depends on geography in a way paper cannot fully overcome. If you look at Lake Superior on a map, it seems defined by shorelines. If you stand beside it, it feels almost borderless. The horizon is low, the wind is steady, and the surface has a weight that photographs rarely carry. In November, the color can shift from iron gray to black-green under cloud. Cold spray can touch your face with a sharpness that stays on the skin. A searcher, looking out over that water, would understand, without needing poetry, why an aircraft could vanish there and leave so little. There were no easy witnesses on the lake that night. No street corners, no porch lights, no crowded station platform where people might remember a sound. There may have been ships or aircraft in the wider region, but the critical event happened in a vast space where human eyes were scarce. The main witnesses were instruments and the people reading them. That gives the Kinross case a distant quality, as though the event occurred just beyond the reach of ordinary human observation. It is not hidden by secrecy alone. It is hidden by location. Location also affects time. On land, a search team can return to a site, walk grids, collect fragments, and mark exact positions. Over deep water, time stretches. A lead may require equipment, funding, weather windows, permits, vessels, and specialists. A promising coordinate can wait years before anyone can examine it closely. Even then, the lake may allow only a partial view. The patient detective has to accept a different tempo, one set by seasons and resources, not by curiosity. This tempo is why the Kinross case can feel almost suspended. The original event was brief. The aftermath has lasted generations. A few minutes over Lake Superior became decades of reading, searching, debating, and remembering. You can feel that contrast as you turn the page. The flight path is a line. The cold case is a room full of boxes. The line is quick. The boxes are slow. Somewhere between them, a family's waiting became history. We should spend a moment with the word cold, because it has a special resonance here. Cold as in inactive. Cold as in old. Cold as in Lake Superior, in late November. Cold as in metal at altitude. Cold as in the archive room where a file waits under fluorescent light. The word gathers meanings without trying. The Kinross case went cold in all those senses. The official urgency cooled. The physical environment was cold from the beginning. The evidence trail cooled as time moved on, yet memory kept a small warmth around the names. That warmth comes from people. It comes from those who remembered Felix Moncler and Robert Wilson as men not just crew positions. It comes from those who kept asking what the radar showed. It comes from those who searched the lake with modern tools. It comes from those who corrected errors in public accounts. It comes from listeners like you, sitting quietly with the case instead of turning it into a spectacle. That is a soft but real form of witness. To listen carefully is not to solve, but it is to refuse indifference. The wider Cold War setting can be easy to flatten into slogans, but daily life inside it was full of routine. Men arrived for shifts. Coffee was poured. Weather was discussed. Equipment was checked. Families lived near bases. Aircraft took off and landed in patterns so familiar that their sound became part of the place. The Kinross disappearance interrupted that routine, but it also arose from it. This matters because real mysteries often begin inside ordinary systems, not outside them. The ordinary system makes the break visible. You can picture Kinross Air Force Base that evening, with a kind of practical plainness. Hangars, runway lights, vehicles moving under low light, mechanics and crew working in cold air, the faint smell of fuel, the sound of a jet engine carrying across open ground. Somewhere inside, duty schedules and readiness procedures shaped the night. The base was not waiting to become famous. It was working. The Scorpion's launch was part of that work, and the tragedy of the case is partly that work did not bring the crew home. The F-89 Scorpion itself belonged to a generation of aircraft built quickly for a changing threat environment. It was designed to intercept, to carry radar and weapons, to operate as part of a defensive network. Such aircraft were impressive, but they were also complex. Complexity gives capability, and it also gives investigators more possible failure points when something goes wrong. Engines, fuel systems, controls, instruments, radar equipment, electrical systems, weather effects, pilot workload, each could matter. Without wreckage, none can be confirmed as the decisive cause. You may find maintenance records mentioned in discussions of such cases, but unless a specific defect connects clearly to the flight, maintenance history can only suggest possibilities. A part replaced last week, a system checked that afternoon, a note about performance. These can be meaningful or irrelevant. Patient investigators do not turn every imperfection into a cause. Machines are always imperfect in small ways. The question is whether an imperfection formed part of the chain. In the Kinross case, the chain is missing several links. There is also the human factor, but we speak of it with care. Human beings fly aircraft, read instruments, make judgments, respond to stress, and depend on training. To mention human factors is not to blame. It is to recognize that flight is an interaction between people, machines, environment, and procedure. Moncler and Wilson were trained officers doing assigned work. If spatial disorientation, workload, or communication difficulty played any role, that would not reduce their dignity. It would place them within the real demands of night interception over featureless water. Featureless water can be deceptive. At night, without a visible horizon, the body may offer false feelings about motion. Instruments become essential. A pilot trained for instrument flight knows this, yet demanding circumstances can still increase risk. An intercept adds tasks. Radio guidance adds dependence. Weather or equipment limitations add strain. We do not know that any of these caused the disappearance, but we include them because they are part of the plausible aviation landscape. The cold case went cold partly because plausibility was abundant and proof was scarce. Proof has a different feel from plausibility. Plausibility says, this could have happened. Proof says, this did happen, and here is why we know. The Kinross case has lived mostly in the first category. Many things could have happened. Few can be shown. You can sense the frustration in that, but also the intellectual quiet it requires. A good detective does not mistake a well-shaped possibility for a settled fact. A good archivist labels the folder correctly and leaves space for what has not been found. The possible collision theory is a good example. The radar convergence naturally leads some minds there. Two returns come together. One aircraft disappears. Collision seems like a candidate, but a collision usually leaves consequences for both aircraft. unless the second object was not what people thought, or unless the radar picture did not represent physical contact. If the other aircraft landed safely and reported no damage, then collision becomes harder to sustain. If no other aircraft can be confirmed, collision becomes more speculative. The theory remains a question, not an answer. Mechanical failure offers another path. Aircraft can fail suddenly, engines can flame out, controls can malfunction, structural or system problems can escalate quickly. Over deep water at night, a crew may have little time to transmit if the emergency is severe. This explanation does not need the unknown return to be anything more than the mission's reason. Yet without Wreckage, it cannot identify the failing part. It remains broad, perhaps reasonable, but incomplete. You can place it on the table and see that it covers much, though not all, of the case. Radar error or misinterpretation offers a third path. Perhaps the unknown return was not where it seemed. Perhaps the convergence was a display artifact. Perhaps the Scorpion's disappearance from radar occurred near the same time for reasons unrelated to the apparent merge. This path explains the strange image without requiring a strange event. But it too depends on technical conditions we cannot fully reconstruct. The original equipment, atmospheric state, operator observations, and exact plotting are not available to us in the clean detail a modern analyst would want. Then there are explanations shaped by secrecy or unusual phenomena. They enter because the Cold War sky was genuinely full of classified activity, and because unidentified aerial reports were part of the public imagination by 1953. We need not dwell on them loudly. We can simply acknowledge that when records are incomplete and the event is unusual, people look beyond ordinary categories. Some of those looks are careful, some are not. In the Kinross case, the absence of recovered evidence means such ideas remain unsupported in the strong sense, even when they persist in discussion. The patient narrator's task is not to mock the persistence. It is to understand why it happens. People persist because the file leaves room. They persist because two men were lost, and no wreckage confirmed the cause. They persist because the radar story has a visual simplicity that stays in memory. They persist because official explanations did not satisfy everyone. They persist because the radar story has a visual simplicity that stays in memory. They persist because official explanations did not satisfy everyone. A search is not renewed. A commander changes. A family receives no new information. A researcher years later asks for a record and discovers that the question is now old enough to belong to archives. You can feel how the case cooled, not like a door slamming, but like a lamp burning lower. Yet an old case can warm again when someone opens the file. That is what we are doing tonight. We are not reviving fear. We are reviving attention. The difference matters. Attention can be calm. It can be compassionate. It can be slow enough to let names and places remain clear. Kinross, Lake Superior, Felix Momkler, Robert Wilson, the F-89 Scorpion, the radar return, the search, the absence. These words come back softly, and each time they do, the file becomes a little less distant. There is a certain patience in geography itself. The distance from Kinross to the search area does not change because people argue about it. The lake's depth does not change because a theory becomes popular. The shoreline remains, weathered and real. The Sulocks continue their work. Aircraft routes change, bases change, technologies change, but the physical setting keeps its own counsel. If a future answer ever comes, it will still have to fit that geography. It will have to belong to the lake, not merely to the imagination. Maps can make geography feel orderly, with lines, labels, and clean blue spaces. But the actual search environment would have been irregular and alive. Waves, cloud cover, wind direction, water temperature, daylight, fuel limits, and aircraft endurance all shaped what could be done. You can imagine search planners drawing areas, then adjusting them as new estimates came in. A pencil line might look decisive on paper, but outside the window, the weather could make that line difficult to fly. The difference between map and world is another quiet reason cold cases resist closure. There is also the question of debris. An aircraft entering water may break apart, scatter, sink quickly, or leave only small floating traces. Cold water can preserve, but it can also conceal. Fuel or oil may spread and vanish. Lightweight material may drift far from the point of impact. Heavy components may descend rapidly. If no one sees the moment, the debris field becomes a guess. Searchers may fly over the right general region and still miss what they need. The lake does not label its evidence for us. In some missing aircraft cases, a small fragment eventually changes everything. A piece washes ashore, a fisherman snags metal, a diver sees a shape, a sonar image is matched and confirmed. The Kinross case has not received that kind of settled gift in the public record. It has had claims, attention, and renewed searches, but not the confirmed recovery that would let investigators examine the aircraft and speak with firmer language. That absence keeps the case in its long, quiet state, always near possibility, never fully inside it. When you think of the families, the difference between a claim and a confirmation becomes very important. A claim can reopen feeling. A confirmation can guide feeling, even if it brings sorrow. Unconfirmed claims leave people suspended again. That is why careful language matters so much. It protects the living from being pulled too hard by each new report. In the Kinross case, every possible discovery should be handled as if someone who loved Moncler or Wilson might hear it, because, in one form or another, someone may. The cold case community, at its best, understands that responsibility. It does not treat every old disappearance as entertainment. It asks what can be verified, what should be left uncertain, and how to speak of people who cannot correct the record themselves. The Kinross case is a good test of that discipline, because it invites wonder so easily. A missing interceptor, a radar merge, a vast lake, a Cold War setting. Those elements can pull a story towards spectacle unless the narrator keeps returning to the quiet facts. So we return. The Scorpion launched from Kinross on the evening of the 23rd of November, 1953. Moncler piloted. Wilson served as radar observer. They were guided toward an unidentified return over Lake Superior. Ground radar reportedly showed the returns converge. Contact was lost. Searches did not recover the aircraft or crew. Later explanations and claims have not fully resolved the case. Repeating this is not a summary. It is a way of keeping the center intact while we move through the surrounding rooms. One surrounding room contains the official atmosphere of the early 1950s. Air defense was not abstract then. It was staffed, funded, drilled, and watched. The fear of attack shaped radar networks and interceptor readiness. Bases like Kinross existed within that broad posture. The men working there were part of a system designed to notice and respond quickly. An unidentified return could not simply be ignored because most unknowns became harmless later. The point of the system was to find out. That ordinary defensive logic set the night in motion. Another surrounding room contains the Great Lakes themselves. They were industrial arteries, weather makers, borders, and graveyards of machines and ships. Lake Superior in particular has always been more than scenery. Its coldness, size, and depth make it a powerful force in any investigation that touches it. The Kinross case cannot be separated from that force. If the same flight had disappeared over farmland, we might have a wreckage field, witness statements, and a cause. Over Superior, the inquiry met a landscape that could keep evidence for longer than a human lifetime. A third room contains memory. This is where old cases become stories people tell at low volume. Local memory may keep the basic facts. Aviation memory may keep the aircraft and crew. Unexplained phenomena memory may keep the basic facts. Aviation memory may keep the aircraft and crew. Once the radio fell silent, investigators lost access to the crew's experience. The third was recovery. Without wreckage, mechanical and physical explanations could not be tested. The fourth was record clarity. Radar observations and later statements left room for disagreement. The fifth was time. As years passed, every unanswered question became harder to ask of the original people and materials. These limitations are not excuses, they are conditions. A patient investigator distinguishes between the two. An excuse stops inquiry. A condition shapes it. In the Kinross case, the conditions shaped every path forward. Searchers had to work with the last known track. Officials had to explain without wreckage. Later researchers had to interpret without complete records. Families had to live without the final certainty that might have come from recovery. The coldness of the case was built from these conditions, one quiet layer at a time. You can feel the layers if you place your hand flat on the imagined file. The top page is a modern retelling, clean and easy to read. Beneath it lies a photocopy of an older article. Beneath that, a typed official note. Beneath that, perhaps a map marked by someone whose name you do not know. Beneath all of it lies the night itself, unreachable except through what was written after. The file is thick, but the event remains thin. That is the paradox of many cold cases. Time adds pages, not necessarily answers. A good detective learns not to be fooled by thickness. A thick file can contain repetition, speculation, correspondence, and dead ends. It can feel substantial, while the central evidence remains scarce. The Kinross file, in public memory, has grown thick with discussion. But the core remains simple and unresolved. We handle that simplicity carefully. We do not pad it with certainty. We let the surrounding details explain why simplicity did not lead to closure. One of those surrounding details is the nature of military secrecy, though we should approach it soberly. Military organizations protect information for many reasons, some routine, some sensitive, and some merely bureaucratic. A lack of available detail does not automatically prove concealment. It may reflect classification, retention schedules, lost records, or ordinary administrative narrowing. Still, in a Cold War case involving an unknown radar return, secrecy becomes part of how people interpret the silence. You can understand that without letting it dominate the room. The patient question is not what might be hidden. It is what can be shown. That question keeps the desk clear. It lets us examine available records first. It lets us ask whether claims are supported. It lets us notice when a theory depends entirely on what is missing. Missing records can matter, but absence alone is a fragile foundation. In the Kinross case, the missing aircraft is already a large enough absence. We do not need to build further structures unless evidence can bear them. Still, official uncertainty can leave families feeling as though the ground is not firm. A presumed loss is different from a known crash site. A probable explanation is different from recovered proof. The language may be accurate, but it does not satisfy the human need to stand somewhere definite. You can imagine a family member reading presumed and feeling the word settle heavily. Presumed is a necessary word in records. It is also a hard word in a home. The same hardness appears in the phrase missing. Missing is not only a status, it is a condition imposed on everyone who waits. It holds the door open in a painful way. It asks people to live with two realities, what is almost certainly true and what has not been physically confirmed. In the Kinross case, the cold lake and absent wreckage helped keep that word alive longer than anyone would have wanted. The file could move forward administratively, but emotionally, the missing remained missing. Cold cases often depend on future technology for possible resolution. That future may be sonar, genetic testing, database comparison, satellite imagery, or new archival digitization. For Kinross, sonar and underwater search seem the most natural hope because the likely physical evidence lies beneath water. Yet even future technology must begin with a search area, and search areas come from old data. If the old data is uncertain, The new tool begins its work inside that uncertainty. The sharpest instrument still needs to be pointed in the right direction. You can picture a modern search plan forming around old coordinates. A researcher marks possible last radar positions, then draws arcs based on speed, altitude, and descent possibilities. Another person checks wind and drift. Another compares lakebed terrain. A vessel is arranged. Equipment is tested. The plan looks orderly on paper, and then the lake has its say. Weather delays departure. A cable behaves badly. The sonar image is noisy. A promising shape turns into geology. The patient work continues, humbled but not ended. This is why old cases can require endurance more than brilliance. A single, brilliant insight is rare. More often, progress comes from persistence, from checking again, from finding one better record, from searching one more grid, from resisting the easy story. The Kinross case has not yielded a final answer, but the people who have returned to it demonstrate that endurance. They remind us that unresolved does not mean abandoned in every heart. It means the answer has not yet met the evidence. There is a soft moral dimension in that distinction. Abandoned means no one cares. Unresolved means care has not been enough to overcome the limits. The Kinross case is unresolved. It has been discussed, searched, questioned, and remembered. Its coldness is not the coldness of neglect alone. It is the coldness of Lake Superior, of incomplete records, of vanished voices, and of an aircraft that did not come back to tell its story. That distinction lets us honor the effort without pretending the effort succeeded. As we move deeper into the night's account, we might pause beside the role of the rear seat radar observer. In many retellings, the pilot's name naturally comes first, because the pilot is imagined as the central figure in the aircraft. But Wilson's role mattered deeply. The F-89 was designed around a two-person crew, and the radar observer helped make the aircraft an interceptor rather than just a fast machine. He worked with instruments, target acquisition, and the shared task of identification. In the Kinross case, his silence is part of the same silence. You can imagine the rear cockpit as a separate little world. Dim instrument lights, a scope glowing close, the pilot's voice ahead, perhaps heard over intercom, the controller's instructions in the headset, the body held by straps, the aircraft vibrating around him. The observer's task required concentration, especially if the airborne radar was not giving a clean return. We do not know what Wilson saw. We only know that his work, like Moncla's, was directed toward turning uncertainty into identification. That shared work gives the case a quiet intimacy. Two men in one aircraft, each depending on the other, both depending on voices from the ground, all of them depending on instruments. The chain was human and mechanical at once. When it broke, the break was felt across every link. The ground could call, but the cockpit did not answer. The families could wait, but the aircraft did not return. Later researchers could search, but the lake did not yield confirmation. The pattern repeats across time. Call and silence, effort and absence. And yet silence is not the same as emptiness. It can contain duty, memory, and unanswered care. The Kinross case is filled with those things. It is filled with the duty that launched the flight. It is filled with the memory of two officers. It is filled with the care of searchers, families, archivists, and researchers. The fact that the final answer is missing does not make the human content disappear. If anything, it asks us to look more gently at what remains. When people ask why the Kinross case went cold, they may expect one reason. The lake was too deep. The records were unclear. The aircraft was not found. The radar return was disputed. But the more honest answer is layered. It went cold because all of those reasons worked together. A case rarely remains unresolved for decades because of one missing fact. It remains unresolved because several necessary facts are missing at once, and each absence protects the others. Without wreckage, radar uncertainty grows. Without clear radar, the search area widens. Without recovery, theories multiply. You can see the circular nature of it. The unknown radar return makes people want the wreckage. The lack of wreckage makes people return to the radar. The possible other aircraft makes people seek records. The records leave gaps, so people return to the lake. The lake gives no confirmed answer, so the radar story grows again, around and around, slowly, like a hand moving over the same worn page. This is not failure of thought. It is what happens when the central evidence remains out of reach. The case also went cold because history moved on. New aircraft entered service. Old interceptors were retired. Radar systems improved. Personnel changed stations. The urgency of 1953 was replaced by other urgencies, other alerts, other losses, other files. Institutions are made of people, and people can only hold so many active questions at once. The Kinross disappearance became one unresolved matter among many in a century crowded with them. That does not diminish it. It explains why official attention can thin even while private attention remains. Private attention often has a longer memory than institutions. A family can remember for generations. A local historian can keep a clipping long after an office has discarded routine correspondence. A researcher can become interested because a single unexplained line catches the eye. These private forms of memory are uneven, but they are resilient. They kept the Kinross case from vanishing completely into old administrative language. They carried the story into books, articles, archives, and quiet late-night conversations like this one. There is a responsibility in carrying it. We should not make the case more certain than it is. We should not make it stranger than the evidence allows. We should not make it smaller by reducing it to a trivia item. It deserves a middle path, calm and exact, where exactness is possible, gentle where exactness fails. That middle path is the one we have been walking tonight, step by step, with the lake always to one side and the file always under our hand. The room around you may be quiet now. The page may blur a little at the edges. That is all right. The Kinross case does not need to be solved before sleep. It has waited through many nights, many winters, many changes in the world. You can let the facts rest in their places without forcing them together. The base, the radar room, the scorpion, the two men, the cold water, the later searches, each remains clear enough to hold and soft enough to release for a while. But before we let the next page turn, there is another question waiting in the margin, written not as accusation, but as patient curiosity. What would it have taken in 1953 to keep the Kinross case from going cold? A clearer radar record might have helped. A distress call might have helped. A witness might have helped. A floating fragment marked with a serial number might have helped. A confirmed report from the unknown aircraft might have helped. Any one of these could have narrowed the mystery. None arrived in the form investigators needed. That is how absence becomes structure. The missing distress call is a beam. The missing wreckage is another. The uncertain identity of the target is another. The deep lake is the roof over all of it. A cold case is often built from what is not there, and the Kinross case is a quiet example of that architecture. You can walk through it carefully, room by room, noticing how each absence supports the next. It is not a haunted house. It is an unfinished one, standing in weather. The investigators at the time could not wait forever for perfect evidence. They had to form conclusions from the available record. That is the practical side of every investigation. At some point, active searching becomes unlikely to succeed. At some point, Families must be written at some point. Families must be told what officials believe, even if belief is not the same as proof. We may wish the file contained more, but we can understand why it took the shape it did. Understanding is not the same as satisfaction. Satisfaction rarely belongs to cold cases. What belongs to them is patience, and sometimes patience must be enough for a long while. The Kinross case asks for patience with the facts, patience with uncertainty, and patience with the people who tried to make sense of both. It asks us to hold the official record in one hand and the human loss in the other. It asks us to look at Lake Superior not as a symbol only, but as a real investigative barrier, cold and wide and difficult. There is a moment when reading an old disappearance file, when you stop expecting the next page to solve it. Instead, you begin reading for understanding. That shift is quiet, but important. You are no longer waiting for a twist. You are watching how the case became itself. In the Kinross file, that means watching a routine intercept become a missing aircraft case, then an unresolved military loss, then a debated radar mystery, then a long-standing cold case tied forever to Lake Superior. The transformation happened through time. Time hardened some details and softened others. The date stayed firm. The names stayed firm. The lack of confirmed recovery stayed firm. The interpretation of the radar return became more debated. The possible identity of the unknown became more complicated. The emotional meaning deepened as decades passed. You can feel time moving through the file like air moving through an old house, lifting some pages slightly, leaving others still. If you listen closely, the case has a very low rhythm. Launch, track, converge, silence, search, nothing, remember, return. Each word is broad, but none is abrupt. They move like oars in dark water. The rhythm is not there to excite us. It helps us understand why the case stayed with people. The sequence is simple enough to remember, incomplete enough to trouble, and human enough to matter. That combination gives an old mystery its staying power. The next layer we might consider is how public language changed around the case. Early official language would have focused on military loss and search efforts. Later public language often emphasized the unidentified target. Still later, Internet-era discussions sometimes compressed the whole event into a few striking phrases. Each stage can change emphasis. A long, careful case becomes a short, mysterious anecdote. A short anecdote loses texture. Our work tonight is to give the texture back, slowly, so the case is not reduced to one bright point on a radar screen. Texture includes waiting. It includes the hours after the Scorpion disappeared. It includes the search briefings, the cold hands, the weary eyes, the disappointing reports. It includes the families waiting beyond the base. It includes later researchers waiting for records requests. It includes sonar searchers waiting for weather. It includes readers waiting for a confirmation that has not come. The Kinross case is made of many kinds of waiting. The first was urgent. The later ones became patient. But patience does not mean the question stopped mattering. You may imagine the first morning after the disappearance. The sky over the lake lightens slowly. The water is still unforgiving, but now it can be seen. Aircraft lift to search. Men scan the surface. Somewhere on land, officers begin their day with a heaviness already inside it. The base continues to function because bases do. Meals are served. Shifts change. Other duties continue. That continuation can feel almost impossible from the outside, but it is part of institutional life. Even grief must make room for the next task. For the families, continuation would have meant something different. Home life after a disappearance becomes altered in quiet ways. A chair, a photograph, a routine, a letter, a child's question. The military language may arrive in official envelopes, but the absence enters through ordinary rooms. You can imagine the texture of that waiting without intruding on it. Curtains drawn against evening, a radio murmuring, someone reading the same notice again. The world outside going on, which is both necessary and difficult. The case file does not contain all of that, yet a compassionate retelling leaves space for it. Cold cases are not made only of evidence. They are made of evidence and the lives that surround it. The Kinross case went cold in the investigative sense, but it would have remained warm in memory for those who loved the missing men. That warmth is why we say their names carefully. Felix Monclar. Robert Wilson. Not as a refrain for drama, but as a correction against forgetting. As the decades passed, some parts of the case became easier to access while others became harder. Public curiosity grew. Declassified material and archival systems helped researchers in some ways. Modern mapping made geography clearer. Sonar opened possibilities underwater, but the original human sources receded. The men in the radar room could no longer be easily interviewed, if they could be found at all. Memories aged, documents moved, the balance shifted from living investigation to historical reconstruction. That shift is one of the reasons old cases require such patience. Historical reconstruction is slower than immediate investigation. It often begins with fragments. A date in one source, a name in another, a route described differently in two accounts, a military designation that may have been copied incorrectly. You compare, correct, and compare again. You learn to mistrust neatness when it appears too late. You learn to ask whether a detail belongs to the original event or to the retelling of the event. The Kinross case, because it has circulated widely, especially rewards that caution. Caution does not drain the mystery, it makes the mystery more real. When we remove exaggeration, what remains is still unresolved. When we separate radar fact from radar image, the disappearance remains. When we acknowledge ordinary aviation hazards, the lack of recovered evidence remains. When we note possible official explanations, the unease around their incompleteness remains. The case does not need embellishment to endure. Its quiet facts endure on their own. And so we sit with the quiet facts a little longer, while the night outside the imagined archive deepens. The lamp makes a small circle on the desk. The map's blue fades at the edges. The file's top page curls slightly in dry indoor air. Somewhere in the mind, Lake Superior lies under cloud, immense and cold. Somewhere beyond the reach of the page, a flight path crosses the water again and again, each time ending at the same unanswered place. You do not chase it, you simply observe it. The next page may be a later article about a claimed discovery beneath the lake. The tone may be hopeful, perhaps even certain. You read it carefully, because hope deserves care too. A sonar image suggests a shape. A search group believes it may have found the missing aircraft. Coordinates are discussed. Comparisons are made. For a moment, the old case seems to lean toward resolution. You can feel how powerful that moment would be, especially after so many years of silence. Then the patient work begins again. What was actually imaged? Could the object be relocated? Did authorities examine it? Was there a serial number, a piece of structure, an identifying feature? Did independent experts agree? Did the location fit the known flight path? Was the depth plausible? Did follow-up confirm or complicate the claim? These questions may feel dry beside hope, but they protect hope from becoming another wound. In the Kinross case, no claimed lakebed discovery has publicly become the confirmed recovery that would close the central question. That does not mean every search was meaningless. A failed search can still refine understanding. It can rule out an area, test a hypothesis, or show how hard the lake is to read. It can also keep attention on the case, which may lead to other records or other efforts. Patient investigation is full of work that does not produce the hoped-for object. The work still belongs to the story. It shows that silence was met, repeatedly, with effort. Effort has its own atmosphere. The hum of sonar equipment, the damp chill inside a boat cabin, the careful labeling of digital files. The long ride back to shore after an uncertain day. The quiet disappointment when an anomaly becomes rock. The stubborn willingness to try again when weather permits. You can feel how different this is from the first search in 1953, and yet how similar. The tools changed. The lake remained difficult. The question remained almost the same. In a way, the later searchers were following the original radar track through a different medium. The first controllers followed the Scorpion across a screen in the air. Later searchers followed possible traces across screens reading the bottom. Both involved blips, shapes, interpretation, and uncertainty. Both required trained eyes. Both could suggest more than they proved. The Kinross case is full of screens that show something but not enough. That is a small, haunting symmetry, and we can notice it without making it dramatic. The word haunting here does not need to mean frightening. It can mean something that stays. The Kinross case stays because it has the shape of an answer withheld at the last possible moment. The interceptor was close to its purpose. The radar returns came together. Then the record opened into silence. A story like that naturally remains in memory. But memory can be gentle. It can return not as alarm, but as a question placed carefully on the desk before sleep. You might wonder what a resolved version of the case would look like. Perhaps a confirmed wreck site with enough structural evidence to identify the F-89. Perhaps signs of mechanical failure or impact consistent with a known scenario. Perhaps records proving the identity and position of the unknown aircraft. Perhaps a combination of radar analysis and physical recovery that narrows the final minutes. Such a resolution would not undo the loss, but it would change the file's weight. It would move the case from open uncertainty to known sorrow. Without that, the file remains balanced between history and mystery. It is historical because the people, places, aircraft, and date are real and fixed. It is mysterious because the cause and final location remain unresolved. That balance is delicate. Lean too far into history, and you may flatten the unanswered part. Lean too far into mystery, and you may lose the human and technical reality. The calm retelling stays in the middle, where both can be true. As you breathe slowly, you can imagine closing one folder and opening another within the same box. This one contains maps. Another contains aircraft notes. Another contains correspondence about possible sightings or interpretations. Another contains later commentary. The files do not argue aloud. They sit in layers. The detective's work is to let them speak in order, softly, without making the loudest page the most important. In Kinross, the loudest page is often the radar merge. The quieter pages are the search, the families, the lake, and the long administrative fade. The administrative fade is worth understanding. After a military loss, there are procedures for declaring status, handling benefits, recording the aircraft, and preserving reports. These procedures are necessary, but they can create the appearance of finality. A form is completed, a status is assigned, a record is filed, yet the investigative question may remain unresolved underneath. The Kinross case likely lived in that tension. Official processes moved forward because they had to. The deeper question did not move with them. That tension is common in old unresolved losses. An institution needs categories: missing, presumed lost, accident, cause unknown. Category gives a way to manage records, but grief and curiosity do not fit into categories as neatly. They leak around the edges. They ask yes, but where? Yes, but why? Yes, but what did the radar really show? These questions may outlive the forms that first tried to contain them. In the Kinross case, they certainly did. You can feel the old office again, perhaps after the active search ended. The desks are cleared, the phones are quieter, the weather outside remains cold. Someone places the report into a folder. The folder goes into a drawer. The drawer closes with a metal sound that seems too final for what is inside. But the sound is only a drawer. It is not an answer. The lake remains, the families remain, the question remains. Time adds another kind of weather over the file. Public interest rises and falls. Anniversaries bring attention. New claims bring brief brightness. Then quiet returns. This pattern can repeat for decades. Each time, the case is taken out, examined, retold, and put back. Each time, some details may become clearer and others more distorted. The patient narrator's role is to let the returning attention be useful rather than careless. We revisit, but we do not reshape beyond the evidence. There is a humility in saying, "We do not know," after reading so much. It can feel like arriving with empty hands, but that is not quite right. We arrive with understanding. We know why the case matters. We know why it resisted closure. We know the outlines of the night and the limits of the record. We know that 2 men were lost while doing assigned work. We know that Lake Superior made recovery difficult. We know that later explanations did not satisfy every question. That is not everything, but it is not nothing. The Kinross case, then, becomes a study in honest incompleteness. It teaches that some files do not fail because no one looked. Some remain open because the world did not preserve the needed evidence. Water, weather, distance, technology, and time can all become quiet accomplices of uncertainty. None has motive. None can be questioned. Yet together they can keep a case unresolved longer than any human witness remains alive. That is a sobering thought, but not a sharp one. It settles slowly, like dust in a lamplit room. As the next sheet turns, we may find ourselves back with the radar operators, because the case always returns there. They were the last people, in a practical sense, to observe the Scorpion's path. Their screen held the final known movement. Their interpretation became the seed of decades of discussion. It is easy to place too much on them, to expect perfect certainty from a difficult moment. We should resist that. They were workers inside a system, using the tools of their time, recording what they could. The scope itself would not have looked like the clean digital displays people know now. It would have had a living quality, light moving and fading, returns appearing with a kind of soft insistence. The room's darkness helped the screen stand out. The operator's eyes adjusted to its glow. A mark meant attention. Motion meant interpretation. 2 marks drawing together meant increased attention. Then, after the unexpected loss, those marks became memory. You can see how a technical moment became almost symbolic, even though it began as ordinary work. Symbols can be useful, but they can also simplify too much. The merging blips symbolize the mystery, but they are not the whole mystery. The whole mystery includes the weather, the aircraft, the crew, the mission, the possible target, the search, the lakebed, the records, the families, and the decades of unresolved inquiry. If you hold only the symbol, the case becomes thin. If you hold the whole case, the symbol takes its proper place, one important page among many. That is the work we keep doing as the night deepens. We are giving each page its size. The radar page is large. The lake page is large. The human page is largest, though often written in the fewest official words. The speculation pages are numerous, but not all strong. The search pages are patient and difficult. The official explanation pages are numerous, but not all strong. The search pages are patient and difficult. The official explanation pages are necessary and incomplete. The map pages are quiet, blue and wide. Together, they make the Kinross case what it is. Not a riddle to be forced open, but an old file to be handled with steady hands. If your eyes are heavy, you can let the details drift without losing the thread. Kinross. Lake Superior. Moncler and Wilson. The Scorpion. The radar return. The cold search. The unanswered cause. These are the anchor points. Around them, the rest moves slowly, like snow over dark water. Nothing needs to happen quickly here. The file has waited since 1953, and the lake has waited longer than that. We can move at the pace of old paper and deep water. Still, the next portion of the file invites us to consider how stories harden around absence and how a patient detective learns to soften them again. Stories harden around absence because absence leaves room, and the Kinross case has left room for more than 70 years of quiet wondering. Yet tonight, we can let the harder edges soften a little, and we can hold the unknown without trying to make it speak more clearly than it can. The lake remains the lake. The old radar room remains a room of working men and imperfect instruments. The names remain human, and that is where our attention rests. In the real record, the Kinross disappearance remains unresolved. Felix Moncler and Robert Wilson were never recovered. No confirmed wreckage of their F-89 Scorpion has settled the question in public, and no explanation has been proven with the kind of evidence that would finally close the file. The aircraft was lost over Lake Superior on the 23rd of November, 1953, and the answer, if it still exists in metal, silt, or some forgotten record, has not yet come fully into the light. So, we leave it gently where truth leaves it. Not solved, not forgotten, still held between the cold water and the careful page, between the last radar trace and the long patience of everyone who kept looking. You can close the folder now, not because every question has been answered, but because no question needs to be forced tonight. The lamp can stay low, the map can rest under your hand. Somewhere beyond the shore, Lake Superior moves in the dark with its old, slow breathing, and the file is quiet for now.